Welcome back to Grade 7 History, Unit Number 1, New France and British North America, 1713 to 1800. This is Lesson Number 3, What Shaped Canadian Culture? Before we begin today's lesson, let's consider the following. How do different cultures develop? And why do some cultures change over time? When I'm done talking, I want you to put the video on pause so that you can write down your thoughts on these two questions, and we'll have a little discussion about this at the start of our next class. So put the video on pause now. All right, let's proceed. When the first group of French settlers arrived in North America in 1608, they probably had no idea that they would change over time and become a distinct people. In some ways, their traditions and culture did not change. In other ways, they adapted to their new land. For example, they started speaking a different kind of French, which is today referred to as Canadien français. This dialect included words that were never heard of in France, as well as words that were learned from the First Nations. The settlers in New France started calling themselves Canadienne to differentiate themselves from people living in France, as well as from the French-speaking settlers in Acadia. And yes, as you can see from the logo to your left, the NHL's Montreal Canadiens took their nickname from the French settlers in New France. But as a check to make sure that you've listened to this video, why don't you ask me in our next class whether the H in the logo stands for habitants or whether it stands for something else. Most of the Canadian settlers who lived along the St. Lawrence River were farmers. They were also referred to as habitants. The habitants lived on seigneuries. In 1713, the average amount of land that each habitant had to farm on was about the size of a football field. This was not enough to grow enough food to support a large family. Therefore, the habitant learned to fish, hunt, and harvest timber. You'll see here on the left, this is a painting titled The Habitant Farm from 1856. And this is one of many paintings by Amsterdam-born artist Cornelius Krieghoff. Krieghoff was fascinated by the Canadiens during uh, his visits to North America, and he painted many scenes from everyday life in Quebec. Unfortunately, the Canadiens were embarrassed by some of his paintings, which made them look clumsy and foolish. And I know that we're talking about the 1700s, and Krieghoff's work is from the 1800s, but people, even today, will look at his work and they would often mistake it for artwork depicting life in New France in the 1700s. And in ways, life was actually very similar between Quebec in the 1850s and New France in the 1700s. That's why I'm including this one painting here. Many Canadiens took part in the fur trade. This involved traveling far from home and spending months away from one's family. Many young fur traders were called coureurs de bois, a term which means runners of the wood. The coureurs de bois met with First Nations trappers and exchanged goods such as wire, cloth, reading glasses, and guns for beaver pelts. The coureurs took on some of the clothing and practices of the First Nations peoples and learned survival skills from the First Nations. As the fur trade expanded, fur trading developed into a series of small businesses. Some Canadiens became voyageurs, canoeists who worked for fur trading businesses. Unlike the coureurs de bois, the voyageurs could not trade or sell furs. They were hired purely to pick up furs from the First Nations and deliver them to the businesses. And you can see it, they traveled in very large groups. Certainly, they became popular icons of a sort. And prior to Canadians using the $1 coin or the loonie, from about 1935 to 1987, the Royal Canadian Mint actually produced silver dollars. And these were actually, you can find them sometimes in your pocket change. Today, you don't want to spend them because they have some market value and certainly sentimental value. But look at the iconic image on this, the final silver dollar that was printed regularly, showing the Voyager along with the First Nations guide and trapper. By 1713, the Canadienne had been living in New France for close to 3 generations, or 100 years. Many of them had never lived in or even visited France or Europe. However, they still held on to the Catholic faith, which was the main religion in France. King Louis XIV allowed only Catholics to settle in New France, meaning that almost all of the Canadiens were Catholic. However, there were few priests in New France, and few Canadiens were able to attend church on a regular basis. Despite this, the Catholic Church still played a major role in society in New France. The parish priests acted as local leaders and set up schools and hospitals. The Catholic Church was the only provider of healthcare in New France, and the hospitals were run by nuns. The first hospital in New France, called Hôtel Dieu, was opened in Quebec City in 1639. It was run by a group of nuns called the Hospitalier Sisters, and it is still in operation today. Another important change that came from living in New France was the role of women in society. In general, women in New France had a greater level of independence. There were different reasons for this. Canadian women had to be strong and self-reliant. They learned how to cook using foods that were available in North America, such as deer meat, corn, and maple syrup. Wow. Since there were no stores where they could buy clothes, Canadian women sewed their families' clothes. They also had to run the farm for weeks at a time when their husbands and fathers were away due to the fur trade. Women in New France were allowed greater access to education. Some girls received an education from Catholic nuns. Canadian women were able to use their education to work in commercial businesses. Some women even ran their own mills, factories, and tanneries. A law passed in 1690 allowed women to own their own business. The purpose of this law was to help the economy grow. A number of Canadian women became noble, meaning they became wealthy people with high social status. A person from Britain or France who was visiting New France would be shocked by the amount of independence Canadian women enjoyed. So, to close up today's video, here's a couple of questions for you to think about and to write your responses to. Here's question number 1. Would you rather be a coureur de bois or a voyageur? And why do you feel this way? Question number 2. How do you think a European visiting New France would feel about the way the Canadians lived their lives? Would they think, oh, this is interesting, maybe this is something we should have in Europe? Or do you think that they would find this completely unacceptable? So when you feel ready to write your responses to these 2 questions, please put the video on pause. If you don't feel ready though, it means you need to go back, watch this video at least 2 more times, and then put the video on pause so you can write your answers to these final questions. Alright, and I look forward to hearing everybody's ideas at the start of tomorrow's class. But until then, this concludes today's video.